Recording in progress.
Well, good evening again, everybody. I think we'll still have a few people that'll be popping in here as we go along. My name's Kevin Walker. For any of you that I don't know, I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District, and I'm really pleased to be with you tonight to introduce our speaker for tonight's installment of our lecture series. Mr. Noah Crawford is here visiting us from Texas, and tonight's a very special evening because we're unrolling the first of our research fellows. This is a really a great program that has just recently gotten off the ground, and I have some thank yous to make sure that I give tonight and a few shout outs to the people who made this evening possible. You know, the Research Fellowship Program was the idea of Dr. John Moss, who's on the call tonight, a good friend of mine and a dear friend of preservation, a historian of note in his own right. He visited me here in Newmarket some time ago, and I took him up to the library that was being worked on. And he said, "This is fantastic. Have you ever thought about having a research fellow come here and do research and share his research or her research with the world?" And with that conversation, the project was born. And we put out a call for people who may be interested in doing research in our library facility here in Newmarket. And Noah Crawford was selected to be our first research fellow. And backing up, I need to thank Commander Craig Morin, who's a member of our board of trustees, member of our executive committee, and who for a number of years has led the way for all of our education programming. This new fellowship fell under the auspices of his work here with the Battlefields Foundation, and I can't thank him enough for seeing all of these projects through and bringing us to great evenings like this. Our education committee has not only created a library and archives, but we're working with interns and giving out scholarships, and you should look into that program more if it's something that interests you. I'd also want to make sure that I recognize the members of our library team, the volunteers who have worked tirelessly to create the library that our research fellow has been using. We have 5,000 or 6,000 volumes all cataloged on the Library of Congress catalog system that have been painstakingly organized and arranged so that they can be used by researchers from across the country who might come here to the Valley to learn about the Civil War. And I need to thank especially Trish Ridgway and Nita Gibson, who have really led that effort for a number of years, probably close to a decade now. So anyway, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker this evening. Mr. Noah Crawford is a PhD candidate and a graduate assistant lecturer at Texas A&M. He came here all the way from Texas. Will be spending the week with us doing research. He's about halfway through that. We've provided housing for him, a small stipend, and as much research support as we possibly can. His area of expertise and focus is in the social and military history of the Civil War, and his particular research in that area has of late focused on refugees in the war. And it's his assertion that studying the refugees brings together many different aspects of that conflict, from social history, racial history, military history, synthesizing all of that together into one complete story. He really hopes to go into a career in academia when he leaves here. Of course, anyone that comes and works with us in the Battlefields Foundation in any way, we hope that we can convince them to become preservationists. So hopefully that becomes a part of his future as well. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce a really bright young man and a rising historian in our field, Mr. Noah Crawford. Noah, take it away.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here tonight. A huge thank you to the SVBF. If you're in this call, you probably are already familiar with all the great work that they do. You should just go on the website and do yourself a favor and just look at all the people, the wonderful people who make up this organization, the foundation, because all of them have played a huge role in doing things that I think we're all pretty much on board with. That is to say, preserving our historic sites while also using them as active educational facilities. In particular, Nick Paserno, Craig Morin, Kevin Walker, Dan Reinhardt, Jack Owens, John Moss. Again, just go to the website and look at the people who are on the staff. Every single one of them has been so welcoming and done everything that I possibly could imagine. It's been a wonderful week here in Newmarket. and it's wonderful to be back in Virginia. As much as I like Texas, I miss the mountains and the forests of the Old Dominion. One last thing that they didn't tell me to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you haven't subscribed to their newsletter, and if you're not familiar with the SBBF website, you really should be. Again, they do wonderful work, and they do things that I think all of us can get behind. I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. Just give me one moment, and I will pull up a PowerPoint presentation for us so that we have a bit of a visual component here. Just one moment. There we go. All right, so you should now at this point see a PowerPoint on your screen, and you're probably wondering where I got this title from. Pathways Along the Mountainsides, How Refugees Shaped the War in the Valley. A bit of backstory on how I got to this subject. I completed my undergrad at Christopher Newport University in 2019, and when I went to Virginia Tech to study American Civil War history, I was in a bit of a quandary because I knew I wanted to do something related to the Civil War and military history, but I wasn't sure where I could fit in. As you're probably aware, there's about 70,000 books written on the American Civil War. A new one comes out every week. So how does a graduate student kind of find a place in that crowded market? I was sitting in a class on my first day at Virginia Tech, and I asked myself, what's something I've never heard of? What's something about the Civil War that I've never heard discussed? And it popped into my mind right away, and that was refugees. And it was an interesting question that popped into my mind. Were there Civil War refugees? Was the word refugee even a term back then? And as we'll see, it absolutely was. The moment I began doing research on this topic, I realized there is a bounty of sources on refugees. In fact, I couldn't stop running into them. Everywhere you look in primary sources, they talk about refugees during the war years. And again, what was interesting to me was this is something that until very recently, historians have not talked about that much. Until the past 10 years, refugees and displacement has not been something that many historians and scholars have looked at. And yet, if we look at a primary source, this one's from August 1863, the New York Times reporters say that, quote, both the Blue Ridge and the North Mountains are full of refugees and so many passing that they've worn pathways along the mountainsides, end quote. In other words, the refugee crisis in the American Civil War is a massive crisis. The number we're looking at here is around 750,000 people displaced during the 4 years of conflict. We'll talk a little bit about who these individuals are, but first, we'll look at this question that Americans were asking in 1861. Which is what shall be done with them. We'll see that the refugee crisis is something that actually many Americans expected when the American Civil War began in 1861. Then we'll zoom in. Of course, we're at the SBBF's lecture series, so we have got to look at the Shenandoah Valley. This region that was trampled by armies was also trampled by refugees. In part 3, we're going to look at how refugees are turned and weaponized, as political scientists would say, to become agents of the warring armies. And we'll look at the kind of uncertain conclusions of the refugee crisis and how it doesn't really have a clear ending, much like the American Civil War itself. So we'll just jump right in. If you, again, you looked at the talk, you saw the title, and you had to wonder to yourself, refugees, was that even a word in 1861? Well, the answer is yes. And in fact, the very first Webster's Dictionary by Noah Webster in 1828 put refugee as a term, as you can see on the screen here. It's quite simply and quite broadly, one who flies to a shelter or place of safety, end quote. Now that's very broad, and that's actually the kind of broad definition that I use at a scholarly level. If you're curious, and if you're really into international affairs and political science, you'll see that this definition aligns more closely with what modern political scientists would call internally displaced people, or IDPs. But I prefer to use the term refugee in my resource because that's a term that people in the war understood. And we'll see just how frequently the term refugee is used. And you'll also notice in the second part of this definition, it actually makes an explicit reference to an event in American history. That is to say, Loyalist refugees who fled from the colonies after the American Revolution. A lot of people don't realize this, but the United States was founded in the midst of a refugee crisis. About 100,000 Loyalist or Tory individuals in the fledgling United States fled the country when the United States won the war. 100,000 refugees, that's about 1/20 of all American colonists in 1770 fled after the United States wins the war because they don't think that they're going to be safe in a country that they didn't support. If you're an American in the early 1800s, you're familiar with refugee crises throughout your own life and throughout American history. So if you live in, especially in the American Southeast at this time, in the states that become the Confederacy, you're almost certainly familiar with the displacement of Native American people to Western territories, like Indian Territory, as it's been called, modern day Oklahoma. In other words, every American in 1861 had either witnessed in their own lifetime some kind of mass displacement or forced relocation of people, or they'd heard about it from their parents and grandparents, such as these loyalists who fled after the Revolution. And by the way, this isn't just something that's in the history books. This is something that actually many Americans in the 1860s are diving into in their pop culture. It's everywhere in the literature of the era. So in 1855, an author named Charles J. Peterson writes a novel called Kate Alisford, A Tale of the Refugees, which a newspaper predicted would, quote, have greater popularity than that acquired by any other original novel published for years, end quote. Nobody's ever read this book today, but this was something that Americans were expected to rave over in the era. In 1860, we see the publication of the novel on the screen by Henry W. Marr. It's about those loyalist refugees I just mentioned. So you have a fictional writer in the 1860s tapping into these refugee crises in the American past. In 1861, of course, the war only exacerbates, only increases America's desire for refugee stories. We have Paul Pritchard's 1862 novella called The Refugee. Even Herman Melville, the author of the great American novel Moby Dick, his publishers actually took an 1855 novel of his called Israel Potter that nobody was reading, changed the name to The Refugee, and sold it. It sold like hotcakes. In other words, everyone's trying to cash in on the idea of refugees. It's even in the newspapers of the era, and it's in the poetry of the era. You can see this poem that appears in Harper's Weekly, which is the most widely distributed and widely read newspaper in the Civil War era. Bright-eyed, glad-hearted, once she dwelt in lovely Tennessee. Slow-paced, sad-eyed, sad-hearted now, she's here a refugee. This is something that Americans are reading about constantly. It's in their novels, it's in their newspapers, it's in their poetry. Just how popular is this? Just to really hammer this home. The term refugee, this is just the word refugee now, is mentioned by the Chicago Tribune, a major paper, during the war years 678 times. That's just the word refugee. That doesn't include other terms they might use like fugitive or contraband or anything like that. If that's impressive, the New York Times, which is one of the largest newspapers in New York City at the time, references the term refugee 1,071 times during the war years. That means in 88% of New York Times issues during the war, they mention refugees. You'd be hard pressed today in 2024 to find a single word that's mentioned in 88% of New York Times issues. All this to say refugees are as much a part of the war as anything that Americans are experiencing, as much as battles, as much as leaders, as much as generals. And again, what I'm hoping has become really apparent is this is something that Americans recognized in 1860 as part of their history. Everyone knows after Fort Sumter that there's going to be a refugee crisis. In May of 1861, the New York Times, a contributor, asks the readers, quote, "What shall be done with them?" End quote, referring to especially Black refugees in the South. What are Union armies going to do with all the refugees that come into their lines? And this response that you see on the screen right now is from a contributor who offered their own opinion. To this question of what shall be done with them, they suggested, quote, to draft or organize them into supplementary or assistant army, set them to constructing roads to assist on earthworks, utilize them into transporters or provisions or hospital attendants, end quote. So that's one person's idea of what to do with refugees. Another suggestion was actually to send African-American refugees out of the country to places like Haiti. If you're familiar with Civil War history, this might sound familiar. The American Colonization Society at this time was trying to remove former slaves from the country. In other words, before the armies ever met at Manassas or any of these other early war battles, Americans were asking themselves, what shall be done with them? And I'm sure you've heard the expression, history repeats itself, or Mark Twain's take on it, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. How similar does this question sound to one that many policymakers and American citizens are asking themselves today about refugees? What shall be done with them? So let's keep going and zoom in now a bit to the crisis in the Valley itself. As you know, if you're a fan of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation, you know that the Valley in the Civil War is filled with armies and leaders like Stonewall Jackson, Robert Milroy, David Hunter, Phil Sheridan, Jubal Early. You've heard of these armies, you've heard of these individuals, and you're probably familiar with the statistic that the town of Winchester, just up the road, changes hands 70 times or 72 times during the Civil War. Every 3 weeks, the town of Winchester, this picturesque Shenandoah town, changes hands. You can imagine what that means. If you're an individual in that area and your friendly forces come in, you're living well. But if the enemy comes in, now you have reason perhaps to flee. Who are these refugees? Well, of course, you have enslaved people fleeing enslavement to Union lines. They're going to places like Harper's Ferry, was Virginia at the time, now, of course, part of West Virginia. Why Harper's Ferry? It has a canal, it has a railroad, it has major roads into it, and it also has big rivers. It's the last stop before you cross over the Potomac River into the state of Maryland. It's a choke point for refugees. Martinsburg and Charlestown, West Virginia, are also major refugee hotspots in the Shenandoah Valley. And of course, you have pro-Confederate Southerners who are fleeing southward to places like Charlottesville and Lynchburg. They're primarily going to from places like Stanton and Lexington. Even deserters from these armies are trying to hide out in the valley in every hollow and vacant building they can find. If you're curious, many of these unionist refugees, as they're called, that is to say, white Southerners who still support the Union, many of these unionists are a source of great sympathy. Churches in the North launched fundraising efforts to, quote, alleviate the sufferings of the Southern refugees within our lines who have sacrificed all their possessions in their devotion to the Union, end quote. In other words, refugees in the Valley are seen by Northerners as a sign of morality, that the sign that the United States is in the right here. Another paper says that, quote, the helplessness of age, the weakness of woman, the feebleness of childhood can claim no exemption, secure neither pity nor protection from its remorseless cruelty, and yet the men engaged in it claim to be Christians, living under the full blaze of Christian civilization, recognizing the ordinary obligations of Christian duty, and above all, pretend to be fighting for liberty, end quote. That's a long sentence, a run-on sentence, but what does it mean? Quite simply, Northerners believe that all these refugees fleeing into their lines are a sign that they're in the right in this war. And they're using it as a way to kind of combat the image of the Confederacy as fighting for liberty and morality. Let's go back one slide and take a look at this headline. If you're curious, not all these fundraisers are quite hitting a somber tone. This one was in New York City in 1864. It's the Strawberry Ice Cream and Floral Festival to raise money for refugees that are entering Union lines. Why we don't have strawberry ice cream festivals in 2024, I'll never know. But we should bring that back. And my point is, this is not some small clique of New York society. Later on in this article, it says that everyone who matters, is the term they use, in New York City is there. This is something that is in the popular minds of Americans. It's the fashionable thing to do. As strange as that sounds, it's the thing everyone's doing. Supporting refugees shows that you're a patriot who is moral and helping their own country. And of course, again, pop culture is going to come back because these unionists become popular subjects in art. The lithograph here on the left shows unionists' plight as they flee. Notice the imagery going on here. You have a man in a blue coat, the traditional color of the US Army. He's grasping his rifle. He's wearing civilian clothes, but he has one military boot on his leg. In other words, he's just a common everyday American citizen who has been forced out of his state and now is going to have to fight to claim it back. This is a popular image. Notice this sculpture on the right. Again, it's kind of a similar theme. You see the man holding a rifle, wearing civilian clothes, but military boots. On his hip is the powder horn, the symbol of everything in the American founding, right? Riflemen, hit and run tactics. This is a piece of art that's trying to tap in to the heart of how Americans think about their country as everyday citizen soldiers just doing what they think is right. The sculpture on the right is especially interesting because it's by a man named John Rogers, who's a very relatively unknown artist when he makes this sculpture in 1863, but it skyrockets into fame because, again, refugees are a hot topic. It's displayed in the National Academy of Art. It's so popular that they sell out the museum displaying this. John Rogers takes to selling miniature figures of this statue for a whopping $60. $60, that's 3 times more than the average Union soldier makes during this war. If you're curious, I'll spare you the time. $60 in modern money is about $1,500. Imagine if you went into a store, saw a figurine of refugees, and gladly paid $1,500 for it. They sold out. That shows you how prevalent and popular this subject is in Americans' minds. Again, these Valley refugees who in 1861 are fleeing into places like Maryland and Pennsylvania, they're also believed by many Northerners to be part of a potential military force. Some 30,000 of these white Virginians do join the Union Army, a great many of them from the Shenandoah Valley. One of the things that the Army values about refugees in the Shenandoah and throughout Virginia is information that they bring. Refugees are always interrogated by Union and Confederate officers. As soon as they reach one side's lines, they're questioned on enemy dispositions. What is the enemy's strength? Do they have fortifications? Are they moving? How is their morale? Those are things that are difficult for someone just to observing across the lines to know. That's why refugees are valuable as a military asset. They even give their own advice. One Unionist refugee flees to Harper's Ferry, and he tells the Northern newspapers that, quote, 1,000 good Union troops could take the place, end quote, meaning Winchester. It's a good thing they didn't try. There were actually thousands of Confederate troops in the time. But the point is that this information being brought by refugees is a major asset to Union and Confederate operations in the Valley. It also goes a long way towards establishing a bond of trust between Black enslaved people or people who fled enslavement and white Union officers. They actually begin to really trust these Black refugees to the same extent that they trust Unionist white refugees. By some estimates, as many as 3/4 of enslaved people in Shenandoah counties flee to Union lines. So I know what you're wondering. With all this information, do the officers in the Valley actually listen to the refugees? It's one thing to get information, but are they actually acting on it? I'll give you just one quick example for now. On the right is John Geary. He's a tough, grizzled veteran of the Mexican War. He was wounded 5 times in that conflict. Later in the Civil War, he's going to go on to command a division at places like Gettysburg. He's a guy you want on your side. He's reliable, he's smart, he's tough, he's dependable. But even veteran officers like John Geary are subjected to both the information and the perhaps misinformation that these refugees are bringing in. So on May 24th, 1862, it's the middle of Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign that you're probably familiar with. Stonewall Jackson's armies are confusing Union movements. Union commanders are struggling to pin down where Jackson is, how many men he has, things like that. And John Geary panics a bit. He wires the War Department the following, quote, "From a refugee, I learned that a large number of troops are being sent towards the Valley to sustain this movement of Ewell and Jackson," end quote. In other words, he's reporting something a refugee told him to his superiors in Washington. Now that doesn't mean anything, except that John Geary, just 90 minutes later, acts on it. He sends another telegram to Washington just an hour and a half later and tells his superiors that he's withdrawn his command 10 miles out of the Shenandoah Valley. Again, we're probably familiar with the frenzied Union actions to try to counter Stonewall Jackson, all the marching that the foot cavalry does. Less familiar in this very well-known story is the way that refugees were a part of it. The information that they bring into Union lines is often accurate, but not always. And in the case of John Geary, it results in Union troops being taken out of the Valley where they're needed. Why are they needed in the Valley? Well, for one thing, you're probably familiar with the First Battle of Winchester. That's fought just the next day, the day after Geary withdraws his troops from the Shenandoah Valley. What happens? Jackson strikes Nathaniel Banks' army in the First Battle of Winchester. You can read all about this battle if you want. I know the SBVF has some information online on it, but I want to take a moment to look at what happens afterwards. The battle, long story short, is a fiasco for the Union. Jackson crushes a Union army in Winchester, and many Union soldiers are captured as they retreat northward. Well, the Union press gets a hold of these stories, and one that becomes especially prevalent is that Nathaniel Banks allowed Black refugees that were with his army in Winchester to requisition army wagons and to clog the Valley Pike going northward, modern day Route 11. One Unionist who lived in Winchester, Julia Chase, says, quote, "We fear that Banks thought more of getting these Black refugees off than to save the poor soldiers or save the country," end quote. This becomes such a firestorm in northern papers. Nathaniel Banks actually has to take to the press to defend his reputation. He says, quote, "No person not belonging to the army, white or black, was allowed to occupy or use government transportation of any kind," end quote. So if you're curious, of course, Banks is sacked shortly after this and sent way to the Western Theater of the War to Louisiana. What does all this mean? It means that refugees are bringing in information, but it's not always accurate. And even when they arrive in lines, sometimes they're a harbinger to the success of Union or Confederate military efforts. Again, that's just one example, but let's fast forward a bit and go to another famous Valley campaign, that of 1864, involving David Hunter. David Hunter cuts all the way down, or rather up southward, up the Shenandoah Valley, of course, reaches Lynchburg. And during his retreat, though, he brings with him many, many refugees. Here's a quote from an Ohio colonel in his command, quote, "This march from Stanton in charge of prisoners, refugees, contraband, sick, wounded, and a mixed mass of soldiers was by far the heaviest task of duty ever heaped upon me and my cut-up regiment," end quote. This is a veteran officer who's writing in 1864 that this is the hardest job he's had, trying to care for these refugees, trying to deal with refugees as they come into Union lines. Again, the heaviest task ever heaped is his terminology. But what the US realizes about midway through the war is that refugee crises can cut both ways. So I've given two examples of how refugees did not aid Union efforts in the Shenandoah Valley. But now let's look at an example of when they do. In April of 1863, General Orders Number 100 becomes protocol in the US Army. This is famously remembered as the Lieber Code by Francis or Franz Lieber. Lieber is a political theorist and scientist and an intellectual. He's tasked by Lincoln and the War Department with constructing kind of an update of the rules of war, if you will. Again, there's no Geneva Convention at this time. Rules about warfare, so-called, are very pliable, or at least some people believe they're pliable. And so Lieber's Code, General Orders 100, 1863, is when we see the establishment of many things that people now think are kind of standard aspects of waging a, quote, civilized, end quote, war. So for example, Lieber's Code says you can't poison wells or food supplies of the enemy. It says you can't torture your enemy. It says you can't kill any prisoners of war. Again, these were things that most armies actually did abide by this time, but now it's formalized. Now these are general orders issued throughout the Union armies. And if you know about the Lieber Code, that's probably what you know it as, a way to restrict United States troops from doing things against what would be called the civilized rules of war. But as John Fabian Witt, the historian, has noticed, the Lieber Code is, quote, "not merely a constraint on the tactics of the Union, it was also a weapon for the achievement of Union war aims," end quote. So this is why in the second half of the war, after this is passed, we see the destruction waged by Union generals like David Hunter and Philip Sheridan, these individuals who realize that refugees are a part of the war no matter what. And they can either help the Union cause or hurt it. And they're going to try to weaponize, that's a modern term, they didn't use that term at the time, but weaponize refugees. So again, in Article 17 of this Lieber Code, we see the precedent for establishing much of the destruction that occurs in the Shenandoah Valley during the second half of the war. Again, war is not carried out by arms alone, it says. And then in Article 156, we see that the Lieber Code basically gives permission to Union authorities that if they determine a Southerner to be working against the Union, he may expel them, meaning forcibly relocate them outside of his own lines. To be clear here, not all Union soldiers are okay with this weaponization of refugees, as it's called, this driving away of people from their homes to prosecute the war. There's a signalman in David Hunter's army, in fact, who talks about the destruction of the city of Lexington, the burning of the Virginia Military Institute. And he says, quote, "It was a pity to do it, but I suppose it could not be helped, end quote. Notice how he talks about this. This is something that he believes to be a necessity for waging this war. When Philip Sheridan's army burned so much of the northern Shenandoah in October of '64, it's not merely to demoralize Southerners or just alone to damage their material capacity, but it's also to precipitate a refugee crisis, to precipitate the movement of people into the Confederate lines. And I'll give you another quote on this in just a moment. Even Sheridan, though, who is remembered as a very hard-line Union general, even he in 1865 begins to wonder about this policy. Hundreds of refugees are arriving outside the Union lines, outside of Winchester, places like Strasburg, and the Union pickets don't know what to do because these are individuals who appear to have pro-Confederate sympathies, but they're starving. It's January, so they're freezing cold. Maybe their homes have been destroyed. They certainly can't feed themselves. 400 wagon loads of refugees arrive outside of Sheridan's lines. So what does Phil Sheridan do? By the way, this is just before the Battle of Cedar Creek, right? Just after the Battle of Cedar Creek. The war is being waged, but Sheridan takes a minute to write to his boss, Henry Halleck, who's basically the chief of staff of the Union armies, and he asks his boss this. He asks them what he can do with these refugees. He says, I am feeding them a bit, but even though they might be pro-Confederate, can I accept them into our lines? And Halleck sends him this response. He says, quote, no authority can be given for the subsistence of rebel armies outside of our lines, nor even within, any longer till they can be removed or sent to their friends and natural protectors. The disloyal people of the Shenandoah south of Winchester and outside of our lines have been and are now at full liberty to join friends in the rebel service or in the other places in the rebel territory. The disloyal within our lines should be sent south to feed upon the enemy. Loyal refugees should be temporarily assisted and sent north where they can earn a living, end quote. That's a long quote. All that's to say, though, I want you to catch that last term, feed upon the enemy. Refugees are no longer just a byproduct of the war in 1864-65. They're actually a means of waging this war. And by the way, I'm only citing these few examples. The Confederates do the same thing in places like Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, famously. Even in states like Kentucky and Missouri, we see this going on. So again, both sides are doing this. The examples I've talked today are just those, a few of those from the Shenandoah Valley. So all that to say, that this has an uncertain conclusion, the refugee crisis in the Shenandoah Valley. Ultimately, about 500,000 Black refugees and 250,000 white refugees are displaced during the American Civil War. 750,000 people. We often remember the American Civil War as America's bloodiest conflict, right? And it is, of course, 625,000 plus killed or died of disease. But let's try to think about the war another way, which is as America's movingest conflict. In other words, in 1861, you stand a better chance of being a refugee from this conflict, again, 750,000, than a fatality from this conflict. So how does that change or maybe alter the ways that we think about the war? Former Winchester resident Cornelia Peake McDonald admitted to a friend 6 months after Appomattox Courthouse in October of '65 that, quote, we are starving, I and my children. End quote. And the Louisville Refugee Commission report, this is just a snippet of it that you see here. In January of '65, this is not a situation that's unique to the Valley. This is going on all across the South and the border states. There's refugees everywhere, and there still is not really a government apparatus, certainly not an effective one, for processing these refugees. If you have any doubt remaining that the refugee crisis in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere was important for individuals at the time, let's take a look at a textbook. In 1866, the war has just ended. So what would you expect on an 1866 US history textbook? Maybe a picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware, maybe a picture of the recently slain martyr of the Union, Abraham Lincoln, perhaps an image of a battle like Bunker Hill, or maybe a battle from the massive war like Gettysburg that the US just fought. Instead, in 1866, one of the most widely distributed textbooks, the front cover has a refugee column on the front. It's not George Washington, it's not Lincoln, it's not Gettysburg. This was something that people at the time believed was a critical part of understanding not just the Civil War, but all of American history. So I ask you, to think about the refugee crisis in the Valley that way, as a critical aspect of the war. This is what they wanted the next generation, their children, to know about the Civil War. I showed you a piece from the New York Times at the beginning from June of 1861, where someone asked, what shall be done with them? That's on the left. You've seen that before. Look at the right. May of 1865, they're asking, this is also the New York Times, the exact same question. What shall be done with them? I'm telling you all this to show that these questions we have about issues throughout history don't go away. This is still a very relevant question today, of course. Both sides, though, do generally fail to construct an effective apparatus. Of course, there is the Freedmen's Bureau, founded in or established rather, goes into work in 1865. The full title of that is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. That's the full title of this organization. And although it does do mesh work, again, this takes 4 years, the entire war, to become an effective organization. I want to close with a quote by the historian Amy Merle Taylor, who wrote the book Embattled Freedom, which won a great many awards just a few years ago. Amy Merle Taylor says this about the slave refugee camps that pop up in places like Harper's Ferry and Winchester. She says, quote, the very act of enduring, of simply living inside the war's slave refugee camps was an elemental part of the story of slavery's destruction in the United States, end quote. And I would say the same thing can be applied to any refugee camp. To understand the American Civil War, I contend we have to understand that refugees were a major part of the political, military, and social developments of the era. And it's important to, if you take something else away from this, just know that things are not binary. Intel from refugees helped, but it also hurt, as we saw with Geary. Refugee flight could congest a roadway, like it did for Nathaniel Banks after Winchester. But commanders could also manipulate refugee flight to hurt the enemy, like we saw Hunter and Sheridan doing. If this subject seems interesting to you, I invite you to look into these other selections. A Diary with Reminiscences is by Cornelia Peake McDonald, who I just mentioned. It's a great firsthand account from a refugee from the Shenandoah Valley. Her home, I believe, is still standing in Winchester. Very recently, Jonathan Noyalis, just up the road at Shenandoah University, wrote a great book on this exact topic of Black refugees in the Valley. And then a quick shameless plug for my master's thesis at Virginia Tech, where I go into a lot more detail, specifically on the military aspect of this in the Shenandoah Valley. That can be achieved just by Googling Noah Crawford Civil War or something like that. So I really hope that this is a subject that is of interest to you. I hope I've shown you that when we think of the American Civil War, you should think of it as the bloodiest conflict, but also as one of the greatest refugee crises that the nation has ever faced, and also that it's just as relevant today as it was for the individuals in 1861. So thank you so much for your attention. I would love to start fielding some questions. I'll go ahead.
Noah, thank you very, very much for that wonderful lecture. As I'm sure all of you agree, that was absolutely fabulous. I was sitting up here wondering whether you would be available to speak at our future conference. I could have listened for the rest of the evening. So thank you very, very much. And I just need to say before we get into the questions that we'd like you to put your questions into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you take your mouse and hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little balloon there. It says chat. Go ahead and type your question in there. That way Noah can pull that up where he's sitting and he can work down through the questions. One more plug for our new fellowship program, and a thank you to everybody who pulled it together. We are honored that Noah is our very first research fellow, and we hope that he'll be followed by other scholars. But just to remind you all, most of you who I know and are intimately associated with the Battlefields Foundation, the reason we're doing this is to support up-and-coming historians so that they can carry the torch on all of these topics that we hold so dear and are going to be so important as we move into the future. The research that they're doing is going to change the field and the understanding of the field, and we need to do everything that we can as an organization and as individuals to support them. Noah, thanks again, and I'll turn it over to everybody for questions. Noah, it looks like there's some questions coming into the chat.
Sure. Well, thank you again, Kevin, for that. And again, they didn't tell me to say this. I cannot speak highly enough about what the SVBF has done this past week. There's no replacement for being on site, being in Newmarket, Virginia, to walk the fields at lunch break. And they've also done a lot of work. There's a lot of signage here in the town of Winchester about unionists in the town of Newmarket, which was a largely pro-Confederate community. But there are many unionists here as well, and I think the SVBF has done a really great job of looking into that aspect of it, especially recently with its new signage. So I'll just go in order here. So John Moss asks a great question, which is kind of tying it into my fellowship here right now during this past week. The resources at the SVBF, again, this 4,000 volume library is indispensable. So I've been working on this topic for about 5 years. Since 2019 is when I started at Virginia Tech, and I first stumbled on this this topic. And what's interesting is I am still constantly finding sources related to refugees. And so I might have mentioned this, but once you kind of start looking for refugees, you can't stop finding them. Every single source you find. So the resources in the library upstairs, I've just been going through, searching for words like refugee, contraband, fugitive. They have a number of other terms for how they talk about displaced people at the time. And there are so many volumes, both secondary sources and primary sources, that is to say, books written by scholars more recently, as well as volumes and books written during the time. There's so many of these secondary and primary sources that I've never come across. I mean, I've found about 30 books, and I'm not even through the library collection, with information I've never discovered. So again, a shameless plug for the SVBF and the research fellowship. And again, they're not telling me to say this. This is, it's been unbelievable the things I've been finding just going through the volumes upstairs throughout the past week. A lot of go Hokies and go Aggies, which I appreciate. A print copy lecture, certainly, I'd be happy to provide it. I'll provide it to through the folks here, and they can disseminate it however they wish. I'd be happy to provide that. A sense of how many people were refugees because they were unsafe, and how many were exiled or expelled? That's a really good question, and it's very tough to say. I'll punt it a bit back over to that 750,000 figure because that's kind of the baseline number that I've been working with throughout this time. But I assume we're kind of looking for more specificity here. I wish I had a better answer, but that's kind of the joy, as strange as that might sound. The interest in this project is that it just keeps going. Like I said, I've been doing this for 5 years and I'm still finding new sources, but I would love to be able to put a pin on a number. That is a priority for me. I believe that is Bruce's question. That is a priority for me. By the time I finish my dissertation at Texas A&M, I'd love to be able to have a more precise figure for how many people fled because they felt like they were unsafe, or maybe fled because of economic provisions. That's a big thing, especially in the Deep South. Not as much in the Valley, but as an example, refugees create economic changes. This might sound obvious. The price of a hotel in Charlottesville, of a boarding house room in Charlottesville, Virginia, increases tenfold during the Civil War. That's because there's so many people fleeing Winchester, fleeing Stanton, and going to Charlottesville. So again, I'd love to have a more precise figure in this, and I'd love to kind of have calculations on why they flee. What are the most common reasons for fleeing? Is it because they're unsafe, or is it because they're forced out? I'd love to, that is a priority for me. So check back in soon, and I hope to have a more precise answer for you. How are refugees treated long-term? This is a great question because again, there's this establishment of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And a lot of people have pointed out that the terminology there implies that freedmen are not necessarily classified as refugees. In other words, if you're going to call an organization the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, that implies that they're not thinking about freedmen or Black refugees as refugees at the time. And I used to think this myself. In fact, I think it's in my master's thesis. One of the other things I've learned this past week in really delving more into primary and secondary sources is there's actually plenty of reference to Northerners and Southerners referring to enslaved people who flee enslavement as refugees, using that term, not just a euphemism like freedman. So I mention that because long-term refugees don't really get any kind of massive government assistance. Now, again, there is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands that's primarily focused on helping former slaves throughout the South. But that program ends in the 1870s. It ends before Reconstruction ends. And I won't get all the way into debates about whether or not Reconstruction was a success or a failure. But the long story short is refugeeing, as they call it at the time, is something that has long-term effects, very long-term effects. Sometimes, if you're fortunate, you think or rather, I should step back. In 1861, many Unionists in the Valley believed this will be a short war. How many times have you read a Civil War book where they said this war will last 90 days or something like that? Refugees are not excluded from this thinking. Many refugees flee their home in places like Harrisonburg and Stanton, and they flee to Maryland, and they expect to be back in 3 months. They expect the war to be over, and they'll just go back and to the way things were. That's not going to happen except in very few cases. Of course, homes are destroyed, and entire industries are economically devastated. So long-term refugees are not treated well. And even though they're a popular subject in popular culture and in the minds of Americans at this era, they're actually not treated super well. When refugees begin arriving in places like Charlottesville or Richmond, they're spurred. Texan refugees, these are Unionists in Texas, this is part of my dissertation, flee into Mexico, and a great many of them are actually killed by mobs in Mexico. The US consulate in Matamoros, Mexico is burned to the ground. So refugees have a very hard go of it, both in the Valley and throughout the country during the war. And it doesn't get easier as time goes on. Great question about Mennonites, Amish, Dunkers, Brethren Path. They are part of these refugees. And in fact, they are the critical mass of these Unionist refugees in 1861. Of course, massive Mennonite communities around Harrisonburg and in Rockingham County and throughout the Valley. And elsewhere too. So today even there's a large Mennonite community in Buckingham County, which is the dead center of Virginia. So they're absolutely a part of this refugee crisis. And many of them, again, flee during the first few months of the war is when we see the most white Unionists trying to get out of the Valley, trying to get out of the South. Okay, great question about the Lieber memo or the Lieber Code. How does it relate to the Missouri-Kansas displacement of loyal Confederates? That is exactly what is used as justification for the displacement. So a bit of a context here for those who aren't familiar with this subject. Late in the war, midway through the war, Union forces depopulate large parts of pro-Confederate Missouri. They forced supposed or professed Confederate sympathizers out of the state. Similarly to this, Ulysses S. Grant in 1862 issues a very controversial order where he expels Jewish people from his district of control and his jurisdiction of Tennessee. These are things that Lincoln is kind of freaking out about. The difference is he countermands Grant's 1862 order, but these displacements in Missouri and Kansas go on because of the Lieber Code, because the Lieber Code has said, these are all the things you can't do to the enemy. But then the other side, it says, these are things you can do. And again, think of that quote I had on the screen. Displacement and expelling, is the term it uses, is a part of that. So it absolutely relates to the Lieber menu, or the Lieber memo, rather. How many of the refugees returned to their homes? We have records of where these refugees fled to. Again, something I'd love to have a precise figure on. But if we look at the second half of that question, for Shenandoah Valley refugees in particular, most Unionists and enslaved people are fleeing to, again, Harpers Ferry, Charlestown, and Martinsburg. Also Washington, D.C. Those are the main areas for Union refugees in the Valley. And then many of the refugees, pro-Confederate refugees, they might flee to a place like Stanton. Well, when David Hunter comes down up the valley in 1864, Stanton's no longer safe. Stanton, of course, is captured by the Union in June of '64. So they have to keep fleeing south. Lexington is a major place, but then Hunter arrives in Lexington. So these refugees flee to places like Lynchburg, Charlottesville. The reason they go to these is actually pretty logical. These aren't just random guesses. They, refugees, it's important to understand these are agents of their own actions. And they're trying to be smart and tactical about this. The railroads are going to take you to rail hubs, right? Places like Lynchburg, places like Charlottesville. And those are the areas where Valley refugees in particular are going to go. Again, if part of my dissertation looks at Unionists in Texas, and they have, again, it's a 700-mile trek from San Antonio to Illinois. So if you're a Unionist in Texas, you have to go through 700 miles of enemy territory to get to safe lines. That's why so many of them flee into Texas or flee into Mexico. We often think of the refugee crises going from Central America into the United States. The Civil War, the American Civil War is an example where you see refugees from the United States or the Confederate States fleeing into Mexico. And again, Mexico's in the midst of its own civil war at the time. So they're not exactly welcome there, but I'd love to, that's another thing I'd love to know. I'd love to be able to put a pin on how many of them are returning to their homes. Again, a great many of them don't because the homes are destroyed. Cornelia Peake McDonald never really lives in Winchester or in her home in Winchester again after the war. Again, it's a great memoir and diary of the war. I think the SBBF sells it. So again, Cornelia Peake McDonald's diary would be a great resource for anyone interested in this topic. And then there's a great question about the majority after Reconstruction. Did they leave diaries, letters, etc.? Yes, absolutely. And those are the treasure troves, right, for my research. A great many of them do stay in the United States. Very few flee to places like Canada or Mexico permanently. Again, a great many go to Mexico during the war, but very few stay there. The kind of famous exception here is that at the end of the Civil War, a great many pro-Confederate Southerners flee to Brazil in the 1860s and become known as Confederados. They have their own community in Brazil. Until recently, I believe they had a festival in Brazil. So again, they're fleeing. These refugees are primarily staying in the United States, to be sure, or in the Confederate States, if you will. But there are some who leave the country altogether, who go outside of the boundaries of the Confederate United States. And again, their letters, diaries, and things like that are absolutely wonderful. Virginia Tech, where I did my master's, has a great number of these refugee accounts. And then there are a great number of historians since then who have created secondary sources. Again, edited works that kind of look more at refugees in this era. Are there any more questions I suppose I should ask? Again, I do have, my email is just my name, Noah Crawford at tamu.edu. If you just Google Noah Crawford Civil War, I should pop up on Texas A&M's page. So I would love to hear emailed questions and things like that. I'd be happy to chat with anyone over the phone if that's easier. But this is a topic that I think, and hopefully I've demonstrated, is an integral part of American Civil War history.
Noah, thank you very much. And we were very, very proud to have you on this evening and for you to be representing us as our very first research fellow. Folks, please stay in contact with us for other programs like this one and get in contact with us. If you have any trouble reaching Noah, we'll put you together with him just as soon as we can. Look at our website for any other upcoming programming. Look for the 160th anniversary events that are coming up before we know it here in September. And don't forget us here in Newmarket. Support Battlefield Preservation because it supports our future. Thanks so much, and you all have a very, very good evening.